At precisely 4:27 p.m. on August 23, 1995, a frantic male voice pierced through the calm of the emergency dispatch line in Springfield, Illinois. "He's hitting my wife. I shot him. He was attacking her with a hammer." The dispatcher attempted to steady the call. The voice on the line, shaky, panicked, belonged to Mark Winger, a local nuclear power plant engineer and father to a recently adopted infant. Within minutes, first responders were racing toward a quiet suburban home on Westview Drive, where tragedy had just unfolded, or so it seemed. When officers arrived, the front door was ajar. The home was still, unnaturally silent. The scene that greeted them was disturbing yet deceptively contained. In the living room, the body of a young woman lay sprawled near the couch, face down, blood pooled beneath her head. A claw hammer was on the floor nearby, partially covered in blood and hair. A second body, male, unfamiliar, was positioned a few feet away, lying on his back with 2 visible gunshot wounds in his torso. The only one left standing was Mark Winger. He wore a white t-shirt stained with sweat and small specks of blood, holding a cordless phone with both hands. His infant daughter, just months old, was reportedly asleep in another room, untouched by the violence. Winger claimed to have walked in on a horrific scene. A strange man, whom he later identified as Roger Harrington, had allegedly entered the home and was in the process of assaulting his wife, Donna Winger, with a hammer. In his desperation, Mark said he retrieved his .45 caliber handgun from the bedroom and fired twice, killing the assailant. In the moment, everything appeared straightforward. A husband defending his wife, a violent intruder neutralized, a tragedy, but with a clear narrative. Investigators at the scene documented it accordingly. Initial impressions supported Winger's version. Donna had sustained blunt force trauma to the head consistent with a hammer, and Harrington had 2 bullet wounds. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, no forced entry, and no other survivors or witnesses. Still, something about the scene gave pause to one of the responding detectives. Despite the violence, the living room was largely undisturbed. A cup of tea sat untouched on a side table. A baby bottle was on the kitchen counter, filled and capped, suggesting the daily routine had only just been interrupted. The layout of the bodies raised questions. Donna's position didn't match the chaotic nature of an ambush. Roger Harrington's posture, almost relaxed, didn't align with someone actively in the middle of a violent crime. But with no other evidence and a grieving, cooperative husband, the case seemed to fall neatly into the box labeled justified homicide. In the hours that followed, the coroner would confirm Donna Winger's cause of death as massive blunt force trauma to the skull. Roger Harrington died of 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. The physical evidence, at first glance, fit the timeline described by Mark. Local media reported it as a shocking yet contained tragedy. An emotionally disturbed man, previously reported for erratic behavior, had returned to the home of a woman he had once made uncomfortable. In doing so, he walked into his own death and took an innocent woman with him. Yet in the days after, pieces that didn't quite fit began to emerge. Donna Winger, 31, had indeed filed a complaint about Roger Harrington just days prior. She had taken an airport shuttle ride with him after a short trip and later told her husband that his behavior made her feel weird and scared. She claimed he spoke nonsensically and even turned around to look at her repeatedly during the drive, making her feel unsafe. Mark, according to records, had contacted the shuttle company to lodge a formal complaint on her behalf. That detail alone added credibility to his story, at least initially, but buried within the dispatch logs was a peculiar detail. Roger Harrington had not simply broken into the home uninvited. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks. It was as if he had been expected. When investigators pulled Harrington's personal effects, they found a crumpled slip of paper in his pants pocket, an address, the address of the Winger residence. That single piece of paper would later unravel the entire case. In the days that followed, Mark Winger was treated with sympathy. He was seen as a grieving husband and protective father, thrust into a situation he had neither asked for nor anticipated. His calm demeanor during questioning, his measured responses, and the tragic loss of his wife all worked in his favor. Friends and coworkers rallied around him. Law enforcement, with limited reason to doubt his story, closed the file as a justifiable homicide. Case closed. Or so it seemed. Because not everything in that living room was as it appeared. The positioning of the bodies, the precision of the gunshots, and the absence of defensive wounds or bruising on Winger all hinted at something else, something darker, something meticulously planned. But the truth wouldn't begin to surface until years later, when guilt, memory, and buried secrets began to stir in someone else's conscience. The tragedy on Westview Drive was only the beginning. The real story hadn't even started yet. In the days following the double death on Westview Drive, news of the tragedy spread quickly across the quiet town of Springfield, Illinois. While most residents knew the neighborhood as a serene slice of Midwestern suburbia, tree-lined streets, carefully trimmed lawns, young families walking strollers in the evenings, the gruesome scene behind the Winger's front door disrupted that image with a chilling permanence. Local media initially portrayed the case as a random act of violence, a failed assault that ended in bloodshed. But even as the headlines faded, the unsettling question lingered. How could something so violent unfold inside a home that looked so safe? From the outside, Mark and Donna Winger had built the kind of life that many aspired to. He was a nuclear engineer, well-educated, respected at his job, and known among peers for his intelligence and level-headed demeanor. Donna worked in the medical field as an MRI technician, empathetic, detail-oriented, and admired for her quiet resilience. The couple had recently adopted a newborn girl after years of infertility struggles, a journey that had taken them through hope, disappointment, and eventually, joy. Photos from that summer showed the young family smiling in their backyard, their new daughter nestled between them in a pink blanket. But pictures lie in silence. They capture smiles, not fractures. And beneath the surface of their seemingly ideal life, signs of emotional turbulence were beginning to emerge, subtle to outsiders, but unmistakable in hindsight. Donna, by all accounts, had entered motherhood with a mix of excitement and quiet apprehension. Friends noticed a shift in her in the months following the adoption. She grew more reserved, sometimes appearing emotionally fragile, sometimes unusually fatigued. In private conversations, she expressed anxiety about her responsibilities, her marriage, and her sense of self. A friend recalled how Donna once said, "I'm trying to keep it together. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning and no one sees it." The change was understandable. Adjusting to new parenthood, even under the best circumstances, can be psychologically destabilizing. In Donna's case, it was compounded by the intense pressure she placed on herself to be perfect. The perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect image of stability. Yet perfection, especially when expected in silence, becomes a trap. And Donna seemed to be caught in it. Then came the ride. Only days before her death, Donna had taken a routine airport shuttle from St. Louis back to Springfield after visiting her family. The trip was supposed to be uneventful. She had left her husband and infant daughter at home, flown out to spend time with her parents, and planned to return refreshed. But what happened during that 2-hour shuttle ride would haunt her final days, and ultimately become the cornerstone of the investigation that followed. The driver assigned to that trip was Roger Harrington. At 27, Harrington had bounced from job to job, often struggling with mental health issues and reported behavioral instability. That day, he arrived late to pick Donna up. During the ride, according to her later statements, he drove erratically and spoke in a disjointed, unsettling manner. He reportedly stared at her repeatedly in the rearview mirror, made vague, ominous comments, and caused her to feel unsafe enough that she considered asking him to pull over and let her out early. When Donna arrived home, visibly shaken, she told Mark everything. She described the encounter in detail, the strange tone of his voice, the looks he gave her, the fears she felt. She even wrote down her experience in a personal note and called a close friend to recount it. Donna was not prone to exaggeration. Her discomfort, her fear, it was real. Mark responded by contacting the shuttle company and filing a formal complaint. His concern for Donna appeared genuine. He told the dispatcher that his wife had been disturbed by the driver's behavior and that they didn't want Harrington sent to their address again. The call was logged, the report was filed. But instead of ending there, the situation escalated in a way no one could have foreseen. Donna believed it was over. She resumed her routine, caring for the baby, keeping the house, trying to stabilize herself emotionally. But something in her tone during those final days suggested she wasn't fully at ease. She became more cautious. She spoke less on the phone. Her friend Deanne later recalled that Donna seemed distracted, as if something was pulling her attention inward, something she couldn't quite name. For Roger Harrington, things were unraveling in a different way. He had been reprimanded by the shuttle company after Mark's complaint. Coworkers described him as agitated, anxious, and increasingly erratic in the days leading up to his death. At some point, he had scribbled down the Winger address on a scrap of paper, although no one could confirm who had given it to him or why he still had it. Whether he intended to apologize, confront, or seek something else entirely remains unknown. What is known is that Roger Harrington entered the Winger household on August 23rd and never walked out. These converging threads, a shaken wife, a disturbed driver, and a protective husband, painted the picture of a tragic coincidence. But as with many stories that appear complete at first glance, there were cracks in the frame, cracks that would later widen into gaping questions. Why was there no sign of forced entry? Why would a man previously reported as a threat return voluntarily to the very home of the woman he frightened? And why did the chaos seem so clean? Behind the calm exterior of that suburban house, a storm had been brewing. And in the aftermath of its violence, only one version of events was left to tell the story, a version that for a time went unquestioned. In every violent crime, there is a moment when chaos crosses the threshold of the ordinary. For the Winger family, that moment arrived in the form of a man named Roger Harrington, 27 years old, emotionally unstable, and in the eyes of the public, a mysterious and menacing figure whose presence in the Winger household would forever change the course of two families. Roger Harrington's life was not one built on stability. From a young age, he had struggled with mental health challenges, diagnosed early on with mood disorders. He had cycled through different jobs, relationships, and living arrangements with little consistency. He was described by those who knew him as offbeat, sometimes kind, sometimes erratic, often misunderstood. His relationships with family were strained, marked by periods of silence and unexplained disappearances. Friends came and went. Jobs never lasted. Stability for Roger was always just out of reach. In 1995, Harrington had landed a job with BART Transportation, a small shuttle company servicing airports in Illinois and Missouri. The position wasn't glamorous, but it offered him structure, routine, and a paycheck. He was known among coworkers for being punctual and quiet, though not particularly sociable. To most, he was a background character in the daily machinery of transportation, forgettable, anonymous, unremarkable. But things started to shift in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Coworkers reported subtle but noticeable changes in Harrington's behavior. He became more withdrawn, his mood seemed volatile, and he often mumbled to himself when alone. Some drivers mentioned hearing him talk about people watching him or controlling his life through radio signals. At first, these comments were brushed off, eccentricities that didn't quite warrant intervention, but as they became more frequent, a quiet unease grew among those who worked alongside him. What happened during his shuttle run with Donna Winger became a critical turning point, though how much of that encounter was shaped by his own perception and how much was misinterpreted remains forever blurred. Donna's account, documented through phone calls and handwritten notes, described the ride as deeply unsettling. She had boarded the shuttle at the St. Louis airport after visiting her family. From the beginning, she felt on edge. Harrington reportedly drove erratically, took unnecessary glances at her in the rearview mirror, and muttered vague, disjointed sentences she could barely understand. Donna was so unnerved that she debated asking him to pull over. She didn't. She rode the entire way home, clutching her purse and forcing polite nods, while her anxiety rose with every mile. When she got home, she told Mark what had happened. She told friends. She wrote it down. Her fear was not just passing discomfort. It was something deeper, a feeling of violation, of being unsafe in what should have been a routine experience. This wasn't paranoia. It was a gut instinct. And she wasn't someone prone to overreaction. Mark took her concerns seriously. He contacted the shuttle company and made an official complaint. The company reprimanded Harrington, although the exact details of that exchange remain unclear. What is clear is that the incident stuck with Roger. In his mind, already unsteady and potentially unraveling, the complaint may have felt like a personal attack, a betrayal, or something far worse. And somewhere in the days that followed, he decided to go back. Why Roger Harrington returned to the Winger home remains one of the most chilling and unanswered questions of the case. Theories range from revenge to confusion, from mental disorientation to a tragic coincidence, but certain facts were indisputable. On August 23rd, Harrington showed up at the Wingers' front door. He wasn't forced inside. He wasn't armed with a firearm. And yet, within minutes, He was dead, shot twice at close range inside the living room. Police recovered a slip of paper in Harrington's pants pocket with the Winger address scribbled in his handwriting. That single detail would become one of the first clues to unsettle the original narrative. Why did he have the address? Had someone given it to him? Had he been invited? At the time, no one asked these questions out loud. They were silenced beneath the weight of a more palatable explanation that a mentally unstable man, previously reported for disturbing behavior, had returned to commit a violent act and was stopped in the process. It was easier to accept this version of events, tidier, more emotionally satisfying. But the deeper truth was more complicated and more disturbing. One of the most tragic elements of Roger Harrington's story is the silence that followed his death. The media quickly painted him as the intruder, the aggressor, the man with a hammer in hand. His name was mentioned in the same breath as threat, unstable, and killer. His family, still reeling from the news, struggled to accept this version of events. They described Roger as troubled, yes, but not violent, not homicidal, not capable of such a targeted, calculated attack. But few wanted to hear it. Roger had no voice left to defend himself, and the narrative was already in place. The public saw a grieving widower and a dead wife. They saw a mother torn from her newborn child. They saw a man who did what he had to do. And they saw Roger as the villain. Yet when one peels back the layers, when one looks not at the ending but the trail leading there, a different shape begins to form. One marked by fragility, misunderstanding, and a disturbing set of coincidences that would, over time, become impossible to ignore. Roger Harrington's name would disappear from the news cycle, but his presence would never truly leave the case. He became the ghost at the center of the story, a man whose final moments were shrouded in questions that justice, at least initially, had no interest in answering. Chapter Summary. This chapter examines Roger Harrington's life, mental state, and behavior leading up to the incident. It highlights the complexity of his character without excusing or condemning him, and it challenges the initial assumptions made about his intent. The narrative begins to question the neatness of the original conclusion by exploring how mental illness and social stigma shaped the portrayal of Harrington in the aftermath of the crime. In the world of criminal investigations, first impressions are both powerful and perilous. They can shape narratives, direct inquiry, and, when mistaken, bury the truth beneath a veneer of logic. For the first responders to the Winger residence, the initial impression was this: a break-in gone violent, a husband acting in defense of his wife and child, and a disturbed intruder silenced by a gun. But as seasoned investigators would later reflect, crime scenes have a way of telling stories that contradict the ones people choose to believe. The living room at 1630 Westview Drive, in its deceptive stillness, whispered inconsistencies from the beginning. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like any other upper-middle-class home, well-furnished, tidy, no signs of disarray beyond the two bodies. The television was off, the baby's bottle remained untouched on the kitchen counter, and a cup of tea sat cold on a nearby end table. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, no signs of forced entry on any of the doors or windows. Even the decorative items on the mantel remained in place, undisturbed. There was no visible struggle, no panic, just death. Donna Winger lay face down, her body at a sharp angle from the sofa, a deep laceration marking the back of her head. A pool of blood had formed around her, large but not as chaotic as one might expect from a surprise attack. The weapon used against her, a heavy claw hammer, was found close to her body. Roger Harrington lay on his back, his arms slightly outstretched, 2 gunshot wounds visible in his chest. The handgun, registered to Mark Winger, was found nearby. The positions of the bodies were important, not because they offered clarity, but because they created more questions than answers. Roger's posture did not suggest an active attacker. He was not hunched over Donna, nor positioned in a way that indicated mid-assault. In fact, based on blood spatter and body angle analysis later conducted by forensics, it appeared he had either been stationary or seated at the moment he was shot. He had no defensive wounds, no evidence that he had swung the hammer more than once, no DNA from Mark Winger on his hands or under his nails. Then there was Donna. Her fatal injury was unmistakable. A single, forceful blow to the back of the head, possibly 2. It was immediately fatal or left her incapacitated within seconds. Yet Mark's 911 call described her as being actively attacked when he entered the room, prompting him to shoot in her defense. This contradiction, though initially ignored, would later raise eyebrows. If she was struck from behind, who was she facing? And if she collapsed instantly, how could there have been a prolonged altercation? The lack of chaos disturbed one of the senior detectives on scene, even if he didn't voice it at the time. In genuine home invasions, particularly those involving violent assaults, the room often reflects the struggle. Furniture gets moved, objects fall, doors slam, victims fight back. But this scene was almost curated. Forensic experts began their work systematically, taking photographs from multiple angles, logging positions of every item, marking drops of blood and potential prints. Their tools were precise, but their task was made difficult by how neat everything appeared. Nothing about the space screamed urgency. It looked like time had stopped just before it should have exploded. One of the earliest discrepancies noted, though quietly, was the trajectory of the bullets. Ballistics later showed both rounds entered Roger Harrington's chest in a clean, downward angle. Given Mark Winger's claim that he shot Harrington during the attack, these angles made little sense. If Roger were standing or lunging, the shots would likely have been more horizontal. The downward angle suggested Harrington may have been seated or crouched, possibly even kneeling. Such details are subtle. They don't scream deception, but they whisper it, and so do the blood patterns. A trained bloodstain analyst, brought in days later to assist with confirming the timeline, found something strange. The spatter patterns on the wall and the blood pools around both victims didn't show evidence of overlap, cross-contamination, or hurried movement between attacks. They appeared isolated, as if two separate acts had occurred within the same space, minutes apart. This, too, challenged the story of a single chaotic event. Of course, in those early hours and days, these findings remained buried within reports. Technical observations noted, but not pressed. There was no formal reason to challenge Mark Winger's account. He was cooperative, grieving, soft-spoken, and by all accounts devastated. He provided a clear timeline, gave permission for a full investigation, and maintained the same story under repeated questioning. His infant daughter, asleep in the next room, served as a living testament to the urgency of his actions. He had, as many believed, acted out of love and desperation. Still, there was something too clean about it all. Veteran investigators sometimes describe crime scenes in emotional terms, not just in what they see, but in what they feel. They speak of rooms that smell like panic or feel like rage. But the Winger living room, for those who returned in the following days to re-examine the space, felt cold. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of the absence of struggle. There was no panic here, no signs of a chaotic, unplanned confrontation, only finality and silence. The silence extended beyond the walls of the home. Despite minor suspicions, the case was not reopened. There was no push for further interviews or forensic reconstruction. Harrington's mental health history was presented as an explanation. Donna's previous report of discomfort during the shuttle ride was framed as foreshadowing. The presence of the hammer, held as key evidence of violent intent, was accepted without question. No one asked why a mentally ill man would return to a stranger's home carrying a hammer in broad daylight, with no clear plan and no prior criminal history of violence. For a time, these questions remained unspoken, overshadowed by the emotional weight of the moment. A young mother had been killed. Her husband, in protecting her, had taken a life. And while that outcome was tragic, it was also, at least from a legal standpoint, justifiable. But for the forensic team, there was a lingering discomfort. Not a declaration of guilt, but an ache of doubt, a sense that the story didn't match the room. Crime scenes don't lie, but sometimes people do. And the only thing more dangerous than a carefully staged scene is one convincing enough to be believed. Grief is rarely straightforward. It doesn't follow clean lines or timelines, and it often refuses to obey the logic we impose on it. Some people retreat, others busy themselves with tasks. Some seek answers. A few carry burdens they were never meant to hold. In the months following the deaths of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington, the community of Springfield remained hushed. There were no further arrests, no sensational trials. Mark Winger, now a widower raising a newborn alone, was widely seen as a man who had endured unimaginable loss and emerged with quiet resilience. Sympathy surrounded him. Neighbors delivered casseroles. Colleagues at the nuclear plant expressed their support. Even the local media moved on, their headlines giving way to more recent tragedies. But not everyone was at peace. Among those left behind was Deanne Schultz, one of Donna's closest friends. She was soft-spoken, unassuming, and largely invisible to the public eye. To most, she was a grieving friend who had lost someone she considered family. But what no one knew, what Deanne had carried in silence, was a truth she had tried to suppress long before the crime occurred. Deanne had spent years close to the Wingers. She had been with Donna through the adoption process, had held the baby not long after her birth, had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and quiet nights over wine. She knew the texture of Donna's voice when she was nervous. She knew the way her smile faltered when something was wrong. And she knew, perhaps better than anyone, what Donna had feared in the final weeks of her life. Because Deanne also knew Mark. And she knew him not just as a friend's husband, but as something else entirely. During the investigation, Deanne stayed silent. Not out of malice, not because she wanted to protect a killer, but because trauma is not always linear. Because guilt and confusion can paralyze, and because fear can linger long after the threat is gone. She had seen too much. She had heard things that made her stomach turn. But for years, she kept those things to herself, buried beneath layers of rationalization, fear, and the hope that maybe, somehow, it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But trauma has a way of eroding silence. It doesn't rest quietly. It returns in dreams, in conversations, in the hollow spaces of memory, where denial can no longer hold the line. Nearly 4 years after the incident, Deanne found herself sitting in front of investigators with trembling hands. She wasn't under arrest. She hadn't been subpoenaed. She was there because she could no longer carry the weight of knowing what she knew. The guilt had consumed her. The anxiety had wrecked her health. And finally, she was ready to tell the truth. Her story changed everything. Deanne confessed that in the months before Donna's death, she had been involved in a clandestine relationship with Mark Winger. It wasn't love, not in the way people imagine it. It was more calculated, more manipulative. She had been emotionally vulnerable. He had been persistent. Their meetings had been secretive, and every time Deanne tried to pull away, Mark would find a way to reel her back in. But it wasn't the affair alone that turned the tide. It was what Mark had said to her. According to Deanne, there were moments, usually late at night after their encounters, when Mark would speak candidly. He would complain about Donna, saying she was emotionally unstable, that she couldn't handle being a mother, that she was a burden. He hinted that life would be easier without her. And then one night he said something she could never forget. "If Donna were gone, would you be with me?" At the time, Deanne dismissed it. She told herself he was venting, that people said strange things in moments of emotional stress. But the comment lingered. It scratched at the corners of her conscience, growing louder in the weeks that followed, especially when Donna, tearful and uncertain, began sharing that she felt unsafe, that something wasn't right, that she feared the man she shared a home with didn't see her the same way anymore. And then, Donna was dead. At first, Deanne told herself it was a coincidence, that the hammer in Roger Harrington's hand justified everything, that the police had reviewed the facts, that the truth had been found. But in her gut, something never sat right. After the deaths, Mark ended the affair. He distanced himself. Deanne was left alone with her guilt, her memories, and a slowly forming realization that she may have been witness, however unwittingly, to a premeditated crime. What Deanne didn't know at the time was that her testimony would reopen a case that had long been closed, that it would trigger a new wave of forensic analysis, cross-referencing, and the unearthing of buried truths. But in that moment, she wasn't thinking about justice or evidence. She was thinking about Donna, about the baby, about the silence she had allowed to persist. Her decision to come forward was not a grand act of heroism. It was an act of conscience, of reckoning, of finally acknowledging what she had long tried to forget. When investigators heard her story, they didn't rush to judgment. They reviewed it with caution, knowing that affairs often complicate perceptions. But as they aligned her timeline with forensic evidence, with inconsistencies in Mark's original statement, and with the subtle clues that had never quite made sense, Deanne's account began to fill in the gaps that no one had dared to name. A new truth began to emerge, one where Roger Harrington may not have been the instigator, one where a grieving husband was not merely grieving, one where the image of a perfect family hid something far more calculated. Cold cases don't reopen themselves. They are revived by something undeniable, an inconsistency too glaring to ignore, a witness too shaken to remain silent, or a detail that, once seen under the right light, refuses to stay buried. In the case of Donna Winger's murder, it was a combination of all three. 4 years after the original investigation had been quietly closed with no criminal charges filed against Mark Winger, a single voice, Deanne Schultz, became the spark that reignited an investigation many believed had already found its resolution. When Deanne finally sat across from investigators, she brought with her not just a confession, but a complete reframing of everything that had once been accepted as fact. Her revelations did more than introduce an affair. They changed the lens through which every prior detail was examined. She hadn't just betrayed her friend, she now held information that suggested premeditation, manipulation, and possibly murder. Her testimony forced law enforcement to look again, this time with the understanding that what had once been perceived as reactive violence might have, in fact, been something much colder. The Springfield Police Department, along with the Illinois State Police, reopened the Winger case in 2000 with little public attention. There were no press conferences, no media leaks. It was a quiet decision, made with cautious determination. Investigators were well aware that overturning a closed case, especially one involving a seemingly respectable, grieving husband, required more than a confession from a guilt-ridden former mistress. It demanded evidence, patterns, a second look at a story that, until then, had seemed complete. The task ahead was painstaking. Cold case work is not about dramatic breakthroughs. It is about returning to old facts with new questions. It is the slow, methodical peeling back of assumptions, and the recognition that initial impressions, no matter how compelling, can be misleading. The first step was to re-examine the 911 call. On tape, Mark Winger's voice was calm, even rehearsed. His distress sounded measured, as though he was trying to hit the right notes. He described a violent attack, a man with a hammer, his wife screaming, himself intervening. But forensic analysts now had a new context in which to listen. If Donna had been struck fatally in the back of the head, and if that blow had rendered her instantly unconscious or dead, then Winger's account of her screaming while being beaten became logistically impossible. The autopsy was clear. The wound was decisive and final. There had been no prolonged struggle, no screams. The story no longer matched the science. Next came the crime scene photos. Blood pattern analysis was re-evaluated. At first, the positions of Donna and Roger had seemed plausible within Winger's version of events. But under more advanced scrutiny, and with updated forensic software, troubling details emerged. The blood spatter from Donna's head wound suggested she had been struck while stationary, possibly seated or kneeling. The lack of blood on Roger's clothing, hands, or shoes conflicted with the assumption that he had just committed a violent assault. And perhaps most telling, there was no blood on the handle of the hammer, a detail that would be expected if he had wielded it with any force. Roger Harrington, investigators now believed, may never have touched the weapon at all. And then there was the trajectory of the gunshots. Ballistics confirmed again what had initially been glossed over. Both bullets had entered Harrington's body at a downward angle, suggesting he was either crouched or seated when shot. This didn't align with the image of a man in the act of attacking someone. In fact, it suggested the opposite, a person vulnerable, possibly confused, unarmed, and not in a position to threaten. The physical evidence, when viewed through the lens of Deanne's testimony, began to tell a new story, a narrative not of chaos, but of orchestration, not of instinctive defense, but of careful control. Investigators also began reviewing phone records. One entry in particular stood out. A call from Mark Winger to Roger Harrington, placed just hours before the murder. It had gone unnoticed in the original investigation, dismissed as irrelevant. But now, it suggested coordination, an invitation, a planned meeting. Harrington, in his personal belongings, had carried a slip of paper with the Winger address written on it. At the time, it was seen as proof of premeditation on his part, a man returning to the house he had once frightened. But now it was evidence of something far more sinister. Perhaps he hadn't shown up to harm anyone. Perhaps he had been lured there under false pretenses. Detectives went back to the complaint Donna had made about the airport shuttle ride, her fear of Harrington, her report to her husband, and the call to the shuttle company. It had seemed clear-cut. But further inquiries revealed something curious. Harrington had been disciplined for the incident, but colleagues later said he seemed confused about the complaint. He didn't deny the ride had occurred, but he insisted he hadn't meant any harm. His mental health history made it easy to dismiss him, but under a more objective light, it became clear that his erratic behavior wasn't matched by violent tendencies. There was no prior record of aggression, no police reports, no history of domestic violence, just a young man fragile and misunderstood, whose greatest offense had been making someone uncomfortable, and who had paid for it with his life. Piece by piece, the case was unraveling. The story that had once seemed so complete, of a protective husband reacting in a moment of terror, was beginning to rot from within. The more investigators examined the evidence, the more it seemed that this wasn't a moment of violence but a setup, a performance, a scene designed to appear tragic but defensible. They began building a new timeline. Mark Winger files a complaint about the shuttle driver. He contacts Roger Harrington directly, invites him to the house under the guise of discussing the incident or offering closure. Roger, perhaps confused or hopeful to clear his name, agrees. And when he arrives, the trap is already in place. Donna, unaware of the true nature of the visit, is present. What happens next is not a struggle, but a sequence. Quick, efficient, final. The gun is fired, twice. The hammer is placed. The 911 call is made. The grief begins, and so does the deception. In every carefully crafted lie, there is a seam. It may be small, nearly invisible, but it is there, a fracture in the facade where truth begins to seep through. For experienced investigators, especially those revisiting a case with new perspective, the art of detection often lies not in dramatic evidence, but in subtle absences, details that are missing, timelines that don't quite fit, actions that make sense only if the narrative is turned inside out. As the reopened investigation into the Winger case entered its next phase, detectives turned their attention to the overlooked and mundane: phone records, calendar entries, timestamps, call logs, and work schedules. These are not the kinds of details that make headlines, but they are often where the truth hides in plain sight. It is within the ordinary that the extraordinary is revealed, when the story told doesn't align with the facts written in ink and time. The 911 call had already been dissected for tone and content, but now it was placed into a broader context. What was happening before that call? What happened immediately after? Who was contacted and when? And perhaps, most importantly, what was left out? The day of the murders, August 23, 1995, was re-examined hour by hour. Mark Winger had claimed that Roger Harrington arrived at his home uninvited, but a phone record indicated otherwise. Investigators discovered a call placed from Winger to Harrington the day before the killings. The duration was brief, less than 2 minutes, but long enough to confirm contact. And when matched against Harrington's own belongings, specifically the handwritten note bearing the Winger home address, the call began to take on new significance. What would motivate a man who had frightened a woman days earlier to return to the very home where that woman lived? Harrington had not been described as violent, nor was he known for confrontational behavior. What if he had been invited? What if he believed he was coming to resolve things, perhaps to apologize, perhaps even under the belief he could defend himself from the accusations made to his employer? That phone call, once dismissed, now stood as a possible invitation to a death sentence. The investigators also turned their attention to Mark Winger's work schedule. According to official records from the nuclear facility where he was employed, Winger had the day off. But the schedule had been altered, handwritten changes instead of typed ones. When speaking with coworkers from that time, detectives learned that Mark had traded shifts days prior, citing personal family needs. The request hadn't raised suspicions at the time, but in hindsight, it suggested intention, planning, control over the variables that might otherwise complicate the events of that afternoon. Detectives asked, why was he home in the middle of a weekday with his infant daughter? Why was Donna, too, at home rather than running errands or resting, as she normally did when the baby was napping? And why did Roger arrive during a window of time when no one else was expected to visit? None of it felt random anymore. Further review of Mark's calendar from that period revealed additional anomalies. Appointments were sparse, but there was a single, unexplained entry for that week, a block of time marked off with no notations, no meetings, no names, no references, just a void between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. on August 23rd. The murders were estimated to have occurred just after 4 p.m., but several forensic experts later proposed that Donna had likely been killed earlier, perhaps even before Roger arrived. That possibility opened a new line of inquiry. Could Donna have been killed first? The physical evidence allowed for that interpretation. She had no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, and her injury had been delivered from behind. She may never have seen it coming. If Roger arrived afterward, unaware, then the pieces began to fit together in a deeply disturbing way. Investigators theorized a chilling sequence. Winger arranges a meeting with Harrington under false pretenses. Donna is killed while alone with her husband, incapacitated instantly. The body's left in place. Harrington arrives shortly after, walks into a house that already hides a corpse. In his confusion, or perhaps before he fully grasps the situation, he is shot. Twice the weapon is planted. The 911 call is made. The final layer was technology, or what little of it existed in 1995. Though cell phone data was not yet as robust as modern GPS tracking, landline records, logs of incoming and outgoing calls, and timestamps on voicemail messages helped establish a window of digital activity. Detectives identified a gap in Mark's activity shortly before the incident, a pause where no calls were made or received, no activity was recorded, and yet both Donna and Roger were somehow killed within that span, a silent pocket of time, now filled with suspicion. More concerning was a note discovered in one of Winger's old personal files, recovered through a subpoena and stored on paper in his garage filing cabinet. The note was vague, written in shorthand, but investigators deciphered it to refer to follow-up WR and resolve Thurs. It wasn't conclusive, but R now had a name, Roger, and Thursday was the day the bodies were found. The fragments were coalescing into something clearer, not just suspicion, not just possibility, but a story written backward in blood and reconstructed in data. And behind that story, an unmistakable pattern was forming. Mark Winger had time, he had motive, and he had control. There had been no randomness, no crime of passion. The trail of calls, the structured schedule, the quiet manipulation of work hours, and the calculated presence of both victims in the house at the same time, all pointed to deliberation, intent. This chapter in the investigation marked the beginning of Winger's unraveling, not because of emotion or impulse, but because of the paper trail he never expected anyone to follow. Because even the most carefully constructed crime cannot outlast time and scrutiny. Because the truth, however deeply buried, tends to resurface when questions are asked the right way. The documents didn't scream guilt, they whispered it, and that whisper was now loud enough to be heard. In the end, it wasn't a single confession or a dramatic outburst that unraveled the narrative Mark Winger had carefully built. It was evidence, quiet, stubborn, objective, the kind that doesn't change under pressure, the kind that lingers in dried blood, trajectory lines, and the silent weight of gravity. As investigators moved forward with renewed urgency, they realized the original crime scene had never been truly chaotic. It had only been made to appear that way. The hammer, for instance, was found near Donna's body, partially smeared with blood, but lacking fingerprints. Not Roger Harrington's, not Mark Winger's, not even smudges consistent with a bare-handed grip. Forensic technicians pointed out that if Roger had been in the middle of a violent attack, as Winger claimed, his prints would be there, gripping tightly, swinging hard. Instead, the weapon showed only surface blood and a lack of directional spatter. It had likely been placed, not dropped, not thrown, but intentionally positioned as part of the aftermath. The gun told a similar story. Ballistics experts confirmed once more that both bullets entered Harrington's torso at a steep downward angle, and based on the location of the shell casings and spatter distribution, he had likely been shot from a standing position while seated or even crouching. He had no defensive wounds, no sign he'd lunged or struggled. Even his shoes were clean, untouched by the blood near Donna, suggesting he had never stepped into that portion of the living room. All signs pointed to separation between the two deaths. Two deaths, two very different moments. One man controlled them both. With these findings in hand, prosecutors and detectives met behind closed doors. The decision to arrest Mark Winger wasn't taken lightly. He had lived as a free man for 6 years. He had continued to raise his daughter. He had remarried. To much of the world, he was a figure of quiet resilience, tragically marked, but moving forward. But justice, when it arrives late, still arrives. In August of 2001, nearly 6 years to the day after the killings, authorities moved in. Winger was arrested at his home without incident. His expression, according to officers on scene, shifted briefly from confusion to recognition. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He simply lowered his head and complied, as if he had known deep down that this moment would come. The interrogation was clinical. Winger remained calm, articulate, emotionally flat. When confronted with the new timeline, the forensic reinterpretation, the phone records, and Deanne Schultz's testimony, he denied everything. He called it speculation. He claimed the investigators were twisting facts to fit a narrative, but for every denial, there was a document. For every protest, a photograph. He had underestimated time. He had underestimated those who refused to forget Donna. The public reaction was immediate and fractured. Friends and neighbors who had once supported Winger were stunned. Some defended him, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the portrait being painted in court documents. Others withdrew quietly, watching from afar as the story shifted beneath their feet. Media coverage, once silent, reignited with full force. The narrative had flipped, from hero to suspect, from protector to predator. The trial began in May 2002. In a packed Illinois courtroom, the state presented a case built not on speculation, but on interlocking proof. Forensic analysts walked the jury through diagrams, blood pattern simulations, and expert interpretations. They demonstrated the spatial impossibility of Winger's story. They showed how Donna's body had no signs of struggle, no bruises consistent with a live altercation. They explained how the lack of forced entry and the presence of Harrington's handwritten note pointed not to a deranged intruder but to a manipulated meeting. Deanne Schultz took the stand. Her voice trembled. She admitted to the affair, to her fear, to her guilt. She repeated Mark's words, "If Donna were gone, would you be with me?" The courtroom was silent. Her testimony added context to intent, shading the murder with emotional motive. Family members of Donna Winger also testified. Her mother, heartbroken but composed, recalled Donna's last days, her private doubts, her subtle fears. She remembered a phone call just days before the murder, where Donna had sounded distracted, tired, worried, not herself. Donna had said she needed to talk. She never got the chance. Mark Winger never testified in his own defense. His legal team tried to cast doubt on the reinterpreted evidence, claiming the scene could still be read as an act of defense, albeit imperfect. But the weight of proof, scientific, chronological, human, was too great. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For the first time in 6 years, Roger Harrington's name was cleared. For the first time, Donna Winger was recognized not just as a victim of tragedy, but of betrayal. In the aftermath, what remained was grief. Quiet, unshakable grief. Donna's daughter Bailey, now a young child, was placed in the care of relatives. She would grow up never knowing her mother, and eventually learning that the man who had raised her for years had taken her mother's life. The Winger home was sold. Friends and neighbors no longer spoke of that summer, and yet, in private conversations, in guarded memories, people still remembered Donna, not as the face in the headlines, but as a woman who smiled gently, who tried to hold everything together, who trusted the wrong person in the end. The story of Mark Winger is one of manipulation and control, but more than that, it is a story about the dangerous illusion of certainty, about how easy it is to believe a grieving man, how natural it is to accept a neat explanation when the alternative is too dark to imagine. But justice, however delayed, is not diminished by time. It arrives not in a rush, but in the steady accumulation of facts, of people who refuse to forget, of truths that wait to be found. Some stories end with answers, others end with echoes. The murder of Donna Winger began as a tragedy, unfolded as a mystery, and resolved as a crime. But in its wake, it left something more enduring than legal closure. It left questions that still resonate, even after the last gavel fell. Mark Winger was once the embodiment of suburban stability, a husband, a father, a professional in a respected field. He lived in a quiet neighborhood. He held his newborn daughter in photographs framed on the mantel. He stood beside his wife at church, and then, with terrifying calculation, he erased all of it in pursuit of something only he fully understood. What makes the case so haunting is not just the brutality, but the contradiction. The man who cried on the 911 call, who sat at funerals with hollowed eyes, who spoke of grief with practiced pain, was the same man who, according to overwhelming evidence, orchestrated the entire tragedy. He weaponized trust. He relied on assumptions. He knew that if he played the part of a grieving husband well enough, no one would look deeper, and for years, no one did. It took a quiet voice, a friend who chose conscience over fear, to reopen the path to truth. It took investigators willing to go back, not just to the scene, but to the mindset of the people involved. It took time and patience, and the belief that justice doesn't expire with time passed. Today, the name Mark Winger is etched not in admiration, but in caution. His is a story studied by law enforcement, criminal psychologists, and students of justice as a textbook example of staged domestic homicide. His trial has been featured in documentaries, lectures, and academic journals, not for its sensationalism, but for its devastating subtlety. Donna Winger is remembered not only as a victim, but as a woman who deserved more time, more protection, more belief when she said she felt unsafe. She was silenced before she could speak fully. But in the end, her story was heard, not through her own voice, but through the facts that remained. Roger Harrington's name, too, was restored. For years, he was labeled a threat, a violent man. In reality, he was a vulnerable figure drawn into someone else's deadly narrative. The tragedy of his death lies not only in how he died, but in how long he was blamed for his own killing. The child at the center of the storm, once shielded from headlines, grew up with the truth eventually revealed, a truth no child should have to carry. This case reminds us that evil does not always enter a home through a broken window. Sometimes it already has a key. Sometimes it lives in the next room, wears a wedding band, smiles in family portraits, and sometimes justice takes its time. But when it arrives, it speaks not with vengeance, but with clarity. The legacy of this lie is not only in the damage it caused, but in the truth that refused to stay buried. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.